Picture a newsroom in San Jose, California, 1996. A reporter sits at a desk surrounded by documents most people in this country were never supposed to see. Court records, DEA files, affidavits from federal drug proceedings, sworn testimony from men inside the Nicaraguan drug trade. And what those documents describe, what they prove in black ink, in signed declarations, in the government's own words, is one of the most devastating things ever done to Black America in the 20th century. This reporter's name is Gary Webb, and the story he is about to publish is going to get him killed, not with a bullet, with something slower, something the powerful prefer. They are going to take his reputation, his career, and eventually his will to keep going. And they are going to do it because the story is true. I want you to hold that image. A man at a desk with the receipts in his hands. Because before we get back to Gary Webb, we have to go to South Central Los Angeles. We have to go to a tennis court. And we have to meet the man whose entire life is the evidence. His name is Ricky Donald Ross. The streets called him Freeway Rick, and what he built and what was built around him and who was really behind it. That is the story the government spent 2 decades trying to make you forget. South Central Los Angeles in the late 1970s is a world the city has already decided to abandon. You need to understand what that means in physical terms, not policy language. It means the jobs left when the factories closed. It means Proposition 13 passed in 1978 and gutted school funding so thoroughly that the schools in Watts and Compton and South Central are running on fumes while schools across town run on futures. It means the LAPD under Chief Daryl Gates is not a police force. It is an occupying army that treats every young black man on those streets as a suspect by geography alone. The Crips have already been founded. The Bloods have organized in response. The geography of South Central is already written in territory and blood. And into this specific world, one specific kid is trying to get out the only way he can see clearly. Ricky Ross grows up in South Central, where he attends a local high school, and the door he is reaching for is tennis. Not the streets. Tennis. He is good enough to draw attention, good enough that coaches notice. But when the scholarship opportunities come, they require reading tests he cannot pass because nobody in the system that was supposed to educate him ever identified that he could not read. Not illiterate because he did not care. Illiterate because the system failed him before he ever had a choice. I'll be honest, that detail messes me up every time I come back to it, because if one teacher had caught it, if one counselor had flagged it, Ricky Ross becomes a tennis story. Instead, he becomes a story we are telling right now. The door to college closes, and in South Central in 1979, when that door closes, you are standing on a corner. The corner has its own economy, and Ricky Ross, who is sharp, who is charismatic, who understands numbers even when he cannot read the words around him, looks at that economy and decides to learn it. But here's what separates Ross from every other kid who made the same decision in those years. His connect is different. His supplier is not a local. His supplier is a Nicaraguan man named Oscar Danilo Blandon Reyes. And Blandon is not in the drug business for the same reasons as everyone else on those streets. Oscar Blandon comes from a wealthy Nicaraguan family. He is college educated. He moves to Los Angeles in the early 1980s not to build a drug empire but to raise money for a cause. The cause is the Nicaraguan Contras, the rebel fighters trying to overthrow the Sandinista government. The Reagan administration is backing the Contras with weapons and training and political cover. Congress, through the Boland Amendment passed in 1982 and strengthened in 1984, explicitly cuts off official funding for Contra military operations. The the administration has to find another way to keep the Contras supplied. And some of the men in that network decide the way is cocaine. Now, let me be precise here, because this story gets twisted in every direction and this channel does not play with the facts. The CIA as an institution did not sit in a boardroom and vote to flood black neighborhoods with crack. What the documented record shows, what congressional testimony, what DEA files, what the Inspector General report of the CIA from 1998 confirms, is that CIA-connected networks knowingly allowed drug trafficking by Contra supporters to proceed, and that the agency looked the other way when it had information that should have triggered law enforcement action. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is the conclusion of the government's own internal investigation, but that decision, that deliberate blindness, had a specific zip code where it landed, and it was not Beverly Hills. Blandon's supplier is a man named Norwin Meneses. Meneses is a Nicaraguan drug trafficker and a major Contra supporter who the DEA had files on going back years. He moves large quantities of cocaine into the United States. He is never seriously prosecuted during the years his network is running. That fact is documented. That fact is not disputed. Blandon connects with Ross around 1982, and what Blandon brings to that partnership is something Ross has never had access to before: volume at a price that makes no street-level sense. According to testimony from federal drug proceedings that Gary Webb later obtained, Blandon is offering cocaine at prices below what any domestic supplier can match. The cocaine is coming in quantity, and Blandon, according to his own later testimony, is sending a portion of the proceeds to Contra supporters. Ross does not know any of this at first. He sees a supplier with product and price, and Ross, who may not be able to read a novel but can absolutely read a market, understands immediately what he is looking at. By the early 1980s, the people at the top of it, the Meneses network and the Blandon network, operate for years without serious federal prosecution. That is not coincidence. That is architecture. Ross is eventually arrested. By the late 1980s, federal pressure on his operation builds to a point where he cannot absorb it. He goes to prison. But the story does not end there, because in prison, Ross begins to understand what he was really part of. He begins to ask questions, and those questions are the same ones Gary Webb is asking in a newsroom in San Jose. Webb is a reporter for the San Jose Mercury News with a history of serious investigative work. He comes to the Contra crack story through a tangential connection, a drug case in San Jose with ties to the Blandon Meneses network. He pulls the thread, and the thread does not stop. What Webb publishes in August 1996, a three-part series called Dark Alliance, is the most comprehensive public documentation to that point of the connection between the CIA-backed Contra network, the Blandon Meneses cocaine operation, and the crack epidemic in Black Los Angeles. He does not claim the CIA invented crack cocaine. He documents what the court records, the DEA files, and the testimony show. They show that a network connected to operations supported by the CIA was a primary supplier to one of the largest crack distributors in American history, and that the government knew and looked away. The San Jose Mercury News accompanies the series with an early website version, making it one of the first major investigative pieces to go viral on the early internet. Black radio stations pick it up. Black newspapers and magazines run with it. Congresswoman Maxine Waters calls for a federal investigation. Communities in South Central that have been decimated by crack for over a decade finally have a name, a paper trail, a documented answer to the question they have been screaming into the void for years. I have been telling these stories for years, and what happens next still genuinely shakes me. The LA Times assigned a large team of reporters, by some accounts more than a dozen, to scrutinize the story. Not to follow the story forward, to tear the story down. They run pieces questioning Webb's sourcing, his methodology, his conclusions. They treat a documented connection between a CIA-backed drug network and the crack epidemic in Black Los Angeles as less credible than the CIA's own denials. The CIA releases a statement disputing the series. The director at the time, John Deutsch, holds a town hall meeting in Watts, in the community that had been ground zero for what Webb documented, and tells residents the agency had nothing to do with the crack epidemic. The crowd does not believe him. The press does. Webb's own editors at the San Jose Mercury News, under the pressure of the establishment media assault, begin to distance themselves from his work. In 1997, the paper runs a partial retraction, not of the facts, but of what it calls the impression that the CIA was directly responsible. Webb is offered a demotion to a suburban bureau. He resigns instead. But here's the thing that the people trying to bury this story did not account for. The receipts are the receipts, regardless of who is attacking the reporter holding them. In 1998, the CIA's own Inspector General releases a report on the agency's relationship to drug trafficking during the Contra-connected era. The report acknowledges that the CIA had information about drug trafficking by Contra-connected individuals and networks, and did not always report it to law enforcement as required. It acknowledges that Blandon and menaces were known quantities in the intelligence world. It is, in its own bureaucratic and carefully hedged language, a confirmation of the core of what Webb reported. The report receives almost no mainstream press coverage. Webb is already gone from the Mercury News. The moment where the government confirms the story is the moment the story is most comprehensively ignored. And now Ricky Ross is back in the picture, and what happens to him next is almost too on the nose to be real. Ross is released from prison in the mid-1990s and is trying to rebuild his life. He is meeting with Blandon, his old supplier, in what Ross believes are conversations about legitimate business opportunities. What Ross does not know, what he has absolutely no reason to suspect, is that Oscar Blandon is now working for the DEA. The man who supplied him with the CIA-connected cocaine pipeline is now a paid federal informant. In 1995, Blandon brokers a deal, a drug transaction that Ross participates in. The DEA is watching. Ross is arrested and charged with conspiracy to distribute cocaine. He is facing life in prison. I want you to sit with that for a second. The government's star witness against Ricky Ross is Oscar Blandon, the man who introduced CIA-connected cocaine to his operation in the first place. The man who, by his own testimony, sent drug proceeds to Contra supporters. The man who the DEA gave a sweetheart deal so generous it became its own scandal. Blandon had faced a potential life sentence of his own. He cooperated. He received a reduced sentence, was released, was given legal residency in the United States, and was paid substantial sums by the DEA as an informant, according to reporting in government records. The man at the top of the pipeline walks. The man at the bottom gets set up by the man at the top and faces life. That is the architecture made personal. Ross's defense team during the 1996 trial tries to argue sentencing manipulation, that the government orchestrated the sting to increase the drug weight and therefore the sentence Ross would face. The judge's sentencing acknowledges that the government conduct in the case was, in his words, outrageous. Ross is still sentenced to life in prison. That sentence is later reduced on appeal, and he serves a lengthy term across his incarcerations before his release in 2009. But the Blandon arrangement, the informant deal, the sting, all of it gets folded into Webb's Dark Alliance reporting as additional documentation of how the system protected itself. The man who could testify most completely about the Contra cocaine connection is on the government payroll. His testimony is not used to investigate the pipeline. It is used to close the man at the bottom of it permanently. Gary Webb spends the years after his departure from the Mercury News trying to rebuild. He freelances. He writes a book, Dark Alliance, Published in 1998, expanding the newspaper series with additional documentation, he applies for journalism jobs and is turned away. His name has become radioactive in an industry that chose institutional comfort over the story he proved. The thing about Webb that I went deep on and that haunts this whole story is that he was right, and he knew he was right, and he watched the world decide that being right was not enough. The CIA's own Inspector General report confirmed his reporting's core claims. Congressional investigators had gotten there before him with the Carey report. The court records he used were real. The connections he documented were real. He was found dead in his Sacramento apartment in December 2004. He was 52 years old. The Sacramento coroner ruled it a suicide by 2 gunshot wounds to the head. The official ruling stands. The circumstances had been questioned by his family and by journalists who covered his case. What is documented and not disputed is that Gary Webb died broke, professionally destroyed, and largely alone. A man who told the truth and was dismantled for it by the institutions whose job was supposed to be the same thing. Maxine Waters, who had called for investigations in 1996, said publicly that she believed Gary Webb told the truth and that his treatment by the press and by the government represented one of the great journalistic failures of the era. She has never walked that back. Freeway Rick Ross, in interviews given after his release, has said consistently that he did not know the full picture of what he was part of when he was running his operation. He has said that if he had known the cocaine he was selling was connected to people using drug money to fund a foreign war, it would have changed things for him. He has become one of the most prominent voices calling for recognition of what Webb documented. He has said in interviews that the crack epidemic was not an accident. It was a policy delivered to black neighborhoods without their consent and without their knowledge. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with, because what it means is that the communities that suffered most from crack cocaine, the mothers who lost sons, the children who grew up in group homes, and the men serving 30-year mandatory minimums for crack weight were not collateral damage in some larger story. They were the destination. The pipeline ran directly to them. The sentencing laws locked them in place, and the institutions that should have protected them were either looking away or actively running interference for the people at the top. Ricky Donnell Ross did not create the crack epidemic in Black Los Angeles. He was a young man with no options and a supplier whose connections reached into the intelligence infrastructure of the United States government. He moved product with extraordinary efficiency, and the destruction that product caused in South Central, in Compton, in Watts, and in black communities across the country is real, documented, and devastating. He does not get to walk away from his role in that. He has never claimed to. But the question this story demands, the question Gary Webb died trying to get people to answer, is not only about Ricky Ross. It is about who handed him the pipeline. It is about who protected that pipeline. It is about why the sentencing disparity fell the way it fell. It is about why the Los Angeles Times went after the messenger instead of the message. It is about why the CIA Inspector General confirmation got less coverage than the original attack on Webb. The receipts exist. They are in court records. They are in the Carey Committee report. They are in the CIA Inspector General assessment. They are in Oscar Blandon's sworn testimony. They are in the federal drug proceedings that Gary Webb pulled before anyone else thought to look. Ricky Ross is still alive. He does public speaking. He runs programs aimed at keeping young people away from the drug trade. He has filed legal challenges related to his case. He talks about Blandon and Meneses and what the pipeline really was. He is one of the last living primary witnesses to the whole architecture, and somewhere in a Sacramento apartment that Gary Webb never walked out of, the question he spent his career asking is still waiting for a complete answer from the people who owe one. The story is not closed. The men who ran the pipeline are not in prison for running it. The institutional decisions that allowed it to proceed have never been fully accounted for. The communities that absorbed it are still absorbing the consequences. The only thing that closed was Gary Webb's door, and the only people who benefited from that are the ones who preferred the dark to the alliance he was trying to expose. Click here to check out another video. Click here to subscribe.